In the city of Albuquerque resided Saul Goodman. The name alone brings up images of flashy suits, morally bankrupt schemes, and a cunning lawyer willing to do anything for his clients, or for himself. But behind the cartoonish exterior of Albuquerque's most notorious criminal lawyer lies a deeply complex and tragic character, Jimmy McGill. Before he became Saul Goodman, Jimmy was a man of ambition and heart, yearning for success and validation. His descent into moral corruption and manipulation is one of the most compelling stories in television history, painting a portrait of a man who constantly walked the thin line between good and evil. This video explores the dark psychology of Jimmy McGill, his upbringing, his choices, and the psychological forces that shaped him into Saul Goodman. We'll analyze how each stage of his life led him closer to moral decay, uncovering the why behind his most despicable actions, what drives a man to abandon his better self, and how does someone justify acts of manipulation and deceit. Before Saul Goodman, before Jimmy McGill the lawyer, there was Slippin' Jimmy, the nickname that foreshadowed his tendency to con, manipulate and deceive. Jimmy grew up in Cicero, Illinois, the youngest of two brothers in a working class family. His father, a kind-hearted man who ran a small convenience store, was easy prey for con artists and grifters, often giving away money to anyone with a sob story. Meanwhile, his older brother Chuck was the shining star, intelligent, disciplined and destined for greatness. Jimmy idolized Chuck, but felt the sting of comparison. However, it would be his dad who inadvertently taught him an important lesson. In one pivotal moment during a flashback, a young Jimmy watches a con artist scam his father out of money. He tries to warn his father, but the warning is ignored.
Dad, it's a ripoff, just like that bum from last week.
Jimmy.
Sorry to bother you folks. I'm gonna get out of here. I'm gonna...
No. There's $10 for you.
Sir, that is so generous.
This scene is critical. It's here that Jimmy begins to internalize a harsh worldview.
There are wolves and sheep in this world, kid. Wolves and sheep. Figure out which one you're gonna be.
From that moment, Jimmy chose to be a wolf. This mindset led to the creation of Slippin' Jimmy, a small-time con artist who thrived on petty schemes.
As soon as it was cold enough, he'd find a nice, smooth patch of ice. He'd pick his spot, wait for it to get busy, then he'd walk out on the ice and boom! He would biff it so hard, people would come running from 5 blocks away.
Yeah, but did he collect?
Did he collect? Slippin' Jimmy had it dialed in. Okay, one good fall, he'd clear 6-8 grand. That'd keep him in old Milwaukee and Maui Wowie right through Labor Day.
8 grand?
8 grand.
For Jimmy, these early cons weren't just a way to make money, they were a coping mechanism, a way to assert control and avoid feeling powerless like his father. Social learning theory suggests that children often mimic behaviors they believe will be rewarded or protect them from perceived threats. In Jimmy's case, he learned to manipulate because he saw kindness as a weakness and deception as a strength. Another key influence was his strained relationship with Chuck. Chuck's cold, judgmental demeanor often made Jimmy feel inferior. This dynamic fostered deep insecurities that stayed with him throughout his life. According to Adlerian psychology, feelings of inferiority can drive individuals to overcompensate, striving for success in ways that may become unethical or harmful. Jimmy's early acts of rebellion were fueled by this need to prove he was more than just the loser that Chuck saw him as. Thus, Jimmy's childhood laid the foundation for his dark psychology. His father's naivety taught him to distrust kindness, and his brother's lack of respect for him taught him to seek validation through manipulation. These early lessons shaped the man who would grow up to blur the lines between good intentions and self-serving schemes. As Jimmy grew older, he began to yearn for legitimacy, a desire fueled by his complicated relationship with Chuck and his own feelings of inadequacy. After a series of run-ins with the law, stemming from his cons as Slippin' Jimmy, he found himself in a dire situation. Chuck, leveraging his reputation as a respected lawyer, bailed him out on the condition that he would straighten out his life.
I'm a lousy brother, I'm a big screw-up, and if I was just a better person, I would not only stop letting you down, you know what? I'd stop letting me down. And it's about time that I started to make both of us proud. If I don't get out of this, my life is over.
So long as you understand that.
Yeah.
This moment marked the start of Jimmy's journey to becoming a lawyer. To honor this promise, Jimmy enrolled in the University of American Samoa, a correspondence law school, not necessarily the most prestigious, but a step in the right direction. And he did this while working in the mailroom at HHM, the prestigious law firm where Chuck was a partner. His time in the mailroom was a turning point. On one hand, he was inspired by the environment, seeing lawyers as heroes who wielded power and respect. On the other hand, he remained an outsider, dismissed as a joke by the very people he aspired to join.
Let's reassess in 6 months. Thanks for understanding, Jimmy.
This duality of inspiration and alienation further deepened his insecurities. Jimmy's struggle for legitimacy came to its climax when he passed the bar exam, yet his triumph was short-lived. Unbeknownst to Jimmy, Chuck was secretly sabotaging, blocking him from being hired at HHM, which dealt a devastating blow to his self-worth when he found out.
You told him not to hire me. It was always you, right? Right back to when I passed the bar and tried to join the firm, you didn't want me.
You're not a real lawyer. University of American Samoa, for Christ's sake? I worked my ass off to get where I am. And you take these shortcuts and you think suddenly you're my peer?
I thought you were proud of me.
I know what you were, what you are. People don't change. You're Slippin' Jimmy. And Slippin' Jimmy I can handle just fine, but Slippin' Jimmy with a law degree is like a chimp with a machine gun.
Chuck's betrayal wasn't just professional, it was deeply personal. It reinforced Jimmy's belief that no matter how hard he tried, he would never escape his past or earn his brother's approval. Psychologically, this phase of Jimmy's life reflects Erik Erikson's theory of psychosocial development, particularly the stage of identity versus role confusion. Jimmy was caught between his desire to reinvent himself as a legitimate lawyer and the societal and familial roles that continually pushed him back into the identity of Slippin' Jimmy, the family screw-up, and the butt of the joke. When he realized that the legitimacy wouldn't earn him respect, he began to rationalize his manipulative tendencies as a means of survival in an unfair world. Jimmy's growing disillusionment with the legal system also played a critical role. He saw how the powerful bent the rules to their advantage, and rather than fight the system, he chose to exploit it. This moral compromise marked a pivotal step in his transformation. His actions were no longer just about survival, they were a way to assert control and rewrite the rules in his favor. The seeds of his dark psychology were now firmly planted once more, as Jimmy began to blur the lines between justice and manipulation. Jimmy McGill's transformation into Saul Goodman truly began when his world intersected with the criminal underbelly of Albuquerque. After failing to secure a stable position in the legal world and wrestling with the sting of Chuck's betrayal, Jimmy turned to less conventional and more dangerous ways of practicing law. His resourcefulness and knack for manipulation found a new outlet in defending petty criminals, con artists, and small-town crooks. This was when he started to cross the line between right and wrong. One defining moment in this phase was Jimmy's decision to con the Kettlemans, a family involved in embezzlement, by manipulating their emotions and exploiting their fear of exposure. This act wasn't just about making money, it was about taking control in a situation where the odds were stacked against him. The Kettlemans case exemplified Jimmy's growing tendency to justify unethical behavior as necessary for survival. As he continued down this path, Jimmy found himself entangled with Mike Ehrmantraut, a former cop turned enforcer, and eventually drawn into the orbit of the Salamanca cartel. His dealings with Tuco Salamanca, Nacho Varga, and later Lalo Salamanca exposed him to escalating levels of danger and corruption. Jimmy's introduction to Tuco came through a failed con involving two skateboarders. What began as a minor hustle spiraled into chaos when Tuco broke the skateboarder's legs to teach them a lesson. Jimmy narrowly avoided the same fate by using his sharp wit to de-escalate the situation. This encounter was a stark introduction to the violent and unpredictable nature of the real criminal world, forcing Jimmy to think on his feet and manipulate his way out of life-threatening situations. Nacho Varga, another member of the cartel, presented a different dynamic. Unlike Tuco's unhinged violence, Nacho was calculated and business-oriented. Jimmy's initial dealings with Nacho involved a scheme to steal from the Kettlemans, but it wasn't long before their relationship became more entangled. Nacho's more laid-back approach offered Jimmy a glimpse of how manipulation and strategy could thrive in the criminal underworld, which would inevitably pull him in. Lalo Salamanca's arrival marked a turning point. Charismatic yet ruthless, Lalo pulled Jimmy deeper into cartel affairs. One pivotal moment was when Lalo asked Jimmy to visit his guy in prison, a mission fraught with danger and ethical compromise. This task, which involved navigating legal loopholes, exemplified how far Jimmy was willing to go, not just for money, but for that little bit of thrill, to feel that power. In each encounter, Jimmy pushed his moral boundaries further, convincing himself that his actions were justified by necessity, loyalty, or opportunity. This stage of Jimmy's life aligns with the concept of moral disengagement, a term coined by Albert Bandura. Moral disengagement occurs when individuals rationalize unethical actions by minimizing their impact, blaming others, or reinterpreting them as morally acceptable. Jimmy began to employ this mental framework, convincing himself that bending or breaking the rules was acceptable as long as it served a greater purpose, whether that purpose was helping a client, outsmarting an adversary, or simply staying alive. Jimmy's growing association with criminals also tapped into his thrill-seeking tendencies. Individuals who crave excitement and risk often gravitate towards high-stake environments. For Jimmy, the adrenaline of outsmarting dangerous people and walking the fine line between legality and crime became intoxicating, even if he seemingly tried to repel it. Each successful con or escape reinforced his belief in his ability to thrive in chaos. As time went on, Jimmy had all but abandoned the moral compass he once aspired to follow. His descent into the criminal world was marked by a growing reliance on manipulation, deceit, and rationalization, setting the stage for his full transformation into Saul Goodman. From the moment Jimmy met Kim Wexler at HHM, their relationship became one of the most significant forces in his life. Kim was not only his colleague, but also his close friend, and eventually, his romantic partner. Unlike others in Jimmy's world, Kim saw both his charm and his potential, encouraging him to strive for a better, more legitimate path. Early in their relationship, Kim became an anchor for Jimmy. Her support during his struggles with Chuck and his professional setbacks helped him persevere. Kim's belief in him gave Jimmy something he desperately craved: validation from someone he respected. In return, Jimmy's love for Kim motivated him to try harder to stay on the straight and narrow, at least for a while. This dynamic is rooted in the psychological concept of positive reinforcement, where Kim's encouragement reinforced Jimmy's better behaviors. However, their relationship was not without its challenges. As Jimmy's darker tendencies resurfaced, Kim found herself drawn to his rebellious nature, even as she tried to temper it. This duality became a defining feature of their partnership. For example, when they worked together to scam Ken Wins, an arrogant stockbroker, the thrill of the con brought them closer together.
Hey, is this right?
He's gonna come out. Didn't read the fine print.
Yet it also hinted at the dangerous line Kim was willing to cross for excitement and connection with Jimmy. Their bond deepened as Kim became increasingly complicit in Jimmy's schemes. One notable turning point later down the line would be their plot against Howard Hamlin, one of the partners at HHM, where they orchestrated events to discredit him and secure a lucrative settlement for their own benefit. While Kim initially justified these actions as a means to an end, her participation marked a shift in her moral compass, mirroring Jimmy's journey into ethical compromise. Psychologically, Kim and Jimmy's relationship reflects the concept of codependency. Kim's desire to support and save Jimmy often led her to enable his worst tendencies, even as she tried to steer him towards redemption. Meanwhile, Jimmy relied on Kim's belief in him as a justification for his actions, blurring the lines between love and manipulation. Together they shared a dangerous chemistry that pushed both of them further into the moral grey zone, deepening their connection, but also setting the stage for greater conflicts down the line. If Kim Wexler represented the possibility of Jimmy's redemption, Chuck McGill symbolized the opposite, a force that constantly pulled Jimmy towards self-doubt, anger, and ultimately, moral corruption. The relationship between the McGill brothers was fraught with tension, resentment, and betrayal, culminating in events that would forever change Jimmy's path. Chuck's disdain for Jimmy's character and methods was evident from the beginning. As a brilliant but uncompromising lawyer, Chuck viewed himself as the moral superior, holding Jimmy to impossible standards while offering little support. This dynamic created a toxic cycle of validation and rejection, with Jimmy oscillating between trying to earn Chuck's respect and rebelling against his control. The breaking point came when Chuck secretly recorded Jimmy confessing to altering documents in a case involving Mesa Verde, a client that Kim had worked hard to secure.
Jimmy, you do realize you just confessed to a felony?
Yes.
Chuck used this tape as leverage to expose Jimmy's unethical behavior, initiating a legal battle that turned their sibling rivalry into open warfare. The courtroom confrontation between the brothers was one of the most emotionally charged moments of their relationship. You see, Chuck had always claimed to have this condition that made him hypersensitive to electricity and would go over the top with theatrics. Everyone knew of his condition and therefore had things in place to accommodate it, such as turning off the lights when he came into the firm. So Jimmy decided to expose this.
Could you reach into your breast pocket and tell me what's there? Can you tell the court what that was?
A battery.
Jimmy's decision to humiliate Chuck by exposing his fraudulent hypersensitivity wasn't just a legal strategy, it was an act of revenge, born out of years of feeling belittled and dismissed. Psychologically, the McGill brothers' conflict can be analysed through the lens of family systems theory, which examines how family dynamics influence individual behaviour. In this case, Chuck's role as the critical, controlling older sibling reinforced Jimmy's sense of inferiority, driving him to seek validation through increasingly desperate and unethical means. Meanwhile, Chuck's inability to accept Jimmy's flaws revealed his own insecurities, as he projected his fears of failure onto his younger brother. After being exposed in court, Chuck suffered a significant blow to his reputation and mental stability. This exposure left Chuck humiliated and further isolated, as colleagues and peers began to doubt his credibility and mental fitness. In the aftermath, Chuck's mental condition deteriorated, his once meticulous routines became erratic, and his home, previously a fortress of order, descended into chaos. Struggling with the feelings of shame and failure, Chuck attempted to regain control by severing ties with Jimmy and retreating further into his isolation. Despite these efforts, his mental health continued to decline. Ultimately, Chuck would decide to take his own life. The scene of Chuck methodically dismantling his home, kicking over a lantern, and igniting the fire that would consume him was a haunting reflection of his inner chaos. It symbolized his complete loss of hope and his perception that there was no path forward. For Jimmy, Chuck's death represented a profound, albeit repressed, loss. Rather than confront his grief, Jimmy buried it underneath a facade of indifference, further detaching himself from his emotions. This psychological defense mechanism, known as emotional repression, allowed Jimmy to avoid guilt and pain, but also eroded his ability to empathize, pushing him closer to the persona of Saul Goodman. The fallout from Chuck's death was profound. It solidified Jimmy's belief that the world was inherently unfair, and that the only way to survive was to manipulate it to his advantage. In his mind, Chuck's rejection and demise were proof that playing by the rules only led to failure and misery. This realization became the final nail in the coffin of Jimmy McGill, paving the way for Saul Goodman to take over completely. Chuck's death marked the beginning of the end for Jimmy McGill. With his moral compass shattered and his emotional defenses firmly in place, Jimmy's transition into Saul Goodman was inevitable.
So if you want to make more money and keep the money that you make, better call Saul!
Jimmy's decision to rebrand himself as Saul Goodman wasn't just a name change, it was a complete rejection of his former self. One of the most telling moments came when Jimmy launched his flamboyant, morally questionable advertising campaigns.
You are under arrest.
I'd better call Saul! Hi, I'm Saul Goodman. Did you know
these ads, with their flashy visuals and overt appeals to desperation, symbolized Saul Goodman's ethos, exploiting people's vulnerabilities for profit. They also marked Jimmy's willingness to sacrifice his reputation among respectable peers in exchange for quick success, illustrating his complete departure from the legitimacy he once sought. Another pivotal moment in Jimmy's transformation was his handling of the Mesa Verde client list. After losing his law license, Jimmy sold his contact list to a rival firm in a carefully orchestrated betrayal. This act highlighted his increasing reliance on manipulation and his belief that loyalty was meaningless in a world where everyone acted in their own self-interest. His dealings with the Salamanca cartel further entrenched his dark psychology. As Saul Goodman, Jimmy went from navigating legal loopholes to actively facilitating criminal enterprises. A standout moment was when he agreed to essentially launder money for Lalo Salamanca, knowing full well the consequences of his actions. The adrenaline of walking a moral tightrope, coupled with the financial rewards, became addictive. Saul Goodman thrived on the chaos that Jimmy once sought to escape. He represented Lalo Salamanca in a murder case, and bail was set for $7 million. Jimmy was tasked with retrieving the money from a remote location in the desert. However, on his way back, he was ambushed by gunmen who nearly killed him. The ordeal pushed Jimmy to the brink physically and psychologically. He only survived thanks to Mike Ehrmantraut's intervention, but the experience left a lasting scar. Instead of deterring him from the criminal world, however, it reinforced his belief that deceit, manipulation, and risk were necessary tools to survive. Jimmy rationalized his continued involvement as inevitable, further blurring the lines between his moral boundaries and self-preservation. Psychologically, Jimmy's full transformation aligns with cognitive dissonance theory, which explains how individuals reconcile conflicting beliefs and actions by altering one or the other. To cope with his increasingly unethical behavior, Jimmy reframed his actions as necessary evils, convincing himself that he was helping his clients and providing a valuable service. By adopting this mindset, he insulated himself from the guilt of helping criminals and rationalized the most egregious aspects of his work. As Saul Goodman, Jimmy became a parody of his former self, a man who thrived on manipulation, deceit, and the suffering of others. His brightly colored suits, unique office, and over-the-top persona were more than marketing tools. They were a shield against the guilt and humanity he had long buried. By fully embodying Saul Goodman, Jimmy McGill left behind the man who once sought redemption, embracing a new identity defined by corruption, greed, and power. Saul Goodman wasn't just a name, it was a philosophy. For Jimmy, it meant rewriting the rules of morality to suit his needs, turning every obstacle into an opportunity and every relationship into a transaction. He closed the door on Jimmy McGill, leaving only Saul Goodman standing in his place, a man unrecognizable from the boy who once dreamed of being a hero. Saul Goodman's empire was built on manipulation and a network of dangerous associations. However, the cracks in this foundation began to show as the consequences of his actions caught up with him, leading to his ultimate downfall. The first domino to fall was Saul's relationship with Kim Wexler. While Kim initially found herself drawn to Jimmy's schemes, the plot to ruin Howard Hamlin marked a turning point. As mentioned, together they orchestrated an elaborate plan to discredit Howard, leading to a devastating scene where Howard confronted them at their apartment. Tragically, Lalo Salamanca would arrive mid-confrontation, and because Howard was a witness, Lalo ended up killing him in cold blood.
I think I'm in the middle of something. There's really no need to...
Witnessing Howard's death shattered Kim's moral boundaries, forcing her to reevaluate her role in Jimmy's descent. Overwhelmed by guilt and fear, Kim left Jimmy, believing that their relationship was destructive for both of them.
But we are bad for everyone around us. Other people suffer because of us. Apart, we're okay, but together, we're poison.
For Saul, Kim's departure was a psychological blow that further detached him from any remains of Jimmy McGill's conscience. Psychologically, Kim's departure can be understood through the concept of attachment theory. Jimmy's attachment to Kim had provided him with a semblance of emotional grounding, and her exit left him in a weird place. Rather than confront his grief, he buried it under layers of Saul Goodman's flamboyant persona, using work and crime as distractions from his emotional turmoil. Saul's partnership with drug lord Walter White and his assistant Jesse Pinkman was another significant factor in his downfall. Initially, Saul saw the partnership as a lucrative opportunity, helping Walter expand his meth empire. However, as Walter's ego grew, their partnership became increasingly toxic. Saul's role in laundering money, setting up drug deals and managing legal obstacles placed him in greater danger and further eroded his moral boundaries. Walter's eventual exposure as the infamous Heisenberg intensified law enforcement scrutiny of Saul, marking the beginning of the end. A particularly telling moment was Saul's reaction to Jesse's growing disillusionment with Walter. Jesse's moral struggles served as a mirror for Saul, reflecting the moral compromises that he had made. Yet, rather than face these truths, Saul doubled down on his manipulative tactics, pushing Jesse further into the chaos created by Walter. This pattern of behavior highlights Saul's reliance on cognitive dissonance, as he continually justified his actions to maintain his self-image as a clever problem solver rather than an accomplice to murder and crime. As law enforcement closed in on Walter White's empire, Saul Goodman's world began to crumble. His flashy persona and well-known advertisements made him an easy target for investigators, forcing him to flee Albuquerque. The very traits that had made him successful, his willingness to exploit others and operate in legal grey areas, had become liabilities. By the time Saul Goodman disappeared, he was a shadow of his former self, consumed by paranoia and regret. Each decision to bend or break the rules brought him closer to ruin, eroding his relationships, his reputation, and ultimately his sense of self. In the end, Saul Goodman's empire was not built to last. It was a house of cards, collapsing under the weight of his lies and the consequences of his actions. When Saul Goodman's carefully constructed world of manipulation and deceit crumbled, he was forced to abandon his identity and escape into obscurity. Assuming the persona of Gene Takovich, a Cinnabon manager in Omaha, Jimmy McGill lived a life defined by paranoia, isolation, and monotony. However, as his past continued to haunt him, his eventual downfall became inevitable. As Gene, Jimmy's daily life was devoid of the excitement and power he once thrived on. His hypervigilance, a symptom of the constant fear of being discovered, shaped every interaction. This psychological state, often associated with trauma, prevented him from forming meaningful relationships or letting his guard down. Despite his efforts to suppress the Saul Goodman persona, it re-emerged in moments of stress and danger, particularly when a taxi driver recognized him from his Albuquerque days. This encounter marked the beginning of the end for Gene's quiet existence. Unable to resist the pull of his old ways, Gene began orchestrating small cons once again. These schemes provided him with a fleeting sense of control and exhilaration, but also increased the risk of exposure. Psychologically, this behavior reflects a deep-seated conflict within Jimmy, the desire to escape his past, clashing with his need for the power and identity that Saul Goodman provided. Gene's final undoing came when his greed and arrogance led him to target wealthy individuals in elaborate scams. These crimes reignited law enforcement's interest, ultimately exposing his identity. When Gene was arrested, it was not with the bravado of Saul Goodman, but as a man stripped of his illusions. His capture was a moment of reckoning, forcing Jimmy to confront the wreckage of his life. In his final courtroom appearance, Jimmy chose to acknowledge his crimes, shedding the Saul Goodman facade to reveal the remorseful man beneath. His confession was not just a legal plea, but a psychological breakthrough, a moment where he reclaimed a sense of honesty and responsibility that had long been buried under layers of deceit. However, this act of redemption came too late to alter his fate.
86 years.
86 years. But with good behavior, who knows?
Sentenced to 86 years, Jimmy's imprisonment marked the conclusion of his transformation. Behind bars, he was no longer the flashy lawyer or the cunning con artist. Instead, he was a man atoning for his sins, finally confronting the consequences of a life built on manipulation and betrayal. Yet even in prison, glimpses of his charm and resilience persisted, suggesting that while Saul Goodman was gone, the essence of Jimmy McGill remained. The story of Jimmy McGill, Saul Goodman, or even Gene Takovich is a tragic exploration of identity, morality, and the psychological toll of living a double life. It's a cautionary tale about the cost of ambition and the human capacity for both self-destruction and redemption.